All-time rich lists. Yes, they are a thing. Because knowing whom the richest person alive isn't enough. We just absolutely have to know who the richest person in history is. It's important, okay? Now, at the time of recording, the richest person alive is none other than our Lord and Saviour, the first King of Mars, Elon Musk. His net worth is currently around $200 billion US. It's actually quite difficult to comprehend just how much money that is. And yes, I realise it's a valuation rather than movable liquid wealth. Still, 200 billion. Elon is worth roughly the same as the entire national economies of Greece and New Zealand. Now, with this in mind, you might think that Musk is a shoo-in for richest person in history. If you do think this, you're wrong. Possibly. But if Musk isn't top dog, who is? There is one name that often gets bandied about in these kinds of richest ever discussions. A 14th century man by the name of Mansa Musa. His estimated wealth? The most commonly cited figure seems to be a suspiciously neat and tidy $400 billion US. So who was this Mansa Musa, and how did he get so inconceivably rich? Well, he was the ruler of the Mali Empire, a large state in West Africa that encompassed parts of what are now Mali, Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, and Niger. I should note here that technically he was Musa I, 10th monarch of the Qaita dynasty. Mansa is just the Mandinka word for sultan or emperor. The Mali Empire was an extremely wealthy state, and it owed these riches to two key natural resources. And really, if you had to choose two natural resources for your country in the 14th century, these are the ones you want. Gold and salt. The Mali Empire had both of these resources in abundance. In fact, it is estimated that in the 14th century, Mali was the source of over a third and possibly up to a half of all the new gold in all of Eurasia. Little wonder then that amongst Musa's grand regnal titles of Emir of Mele and Conqueror of Garnatar was the somewhat Tolkien dwarvish sounding Lord of the Mines of Wangara. When Musa assumed the throne, Mali was not well known in Europe and the Middle East. It was not totally unheard of. It was, after all, the major trans-Saharan trade hub in the Western Sahara. But real knowledge or awareness of Mali was likely confined to merchants and such like, and even they probably didn't really know what they were talking about. That was about to change. Now, if you have the ears of a fox, you may have already noticed that one of Musa's titles was Emir of Mele, which, of course, tells us that Musa was in fact a Muslim, and all Muslims are required or expected, taking into account physical and financial circumstances, to make a pilgrimage to the house of God in Mecca at least once in their life. This pilgrimage is known as the Hajj. In the early 1320s, Musa decided it was high time he fulfilled his mandatory religious duty and make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And oh gods above and below, what a pilgrimage it was. And before I go any further, I want to note that Musa's Hajj was described in detail by multiple eyewitness accounts, so we can be reasonably sure that what follows is accurate. So, when he departed the empire in 1324, Musa did not go alone. Oh no, quite the opposite in fact. Musa set out from Mali at the head of a procession of around 60,000 people. 60,000. A sizable portion of these were soldiers who formed the Mansa's military retinue, but the greater part were not. Included in these 60,000 were 12,000 of the most attractive slaves in the empire, each and every one of them decked out in the finest silks money could buy, and carrying several gold bars weighing around 1.8 kilograms each. 500 of these slaves travelled ahead of the main procession, all of them garbed in fine silks and bearing a solid gold staff. Among the frankly obscene number of animals that must have accompanied the procession were 80 camels that each bore over 100 kilograms in gold dust. That's a total of 8 tons of gold dust. For those of you who, like me, will describe mathematics as, not my forte. 8 tons of gold dust. Can you imagine? Finally, Musa brought with him an unspecified number of solid gold pieces or coins, but given what he would later do with them, we can safely say that he had about 80,000 gold pieces at a minimum. And all of this was funded by Musa himself. Good Lord. After crossing the Sahara, Musa slowly made his way east to Egypt, supposedly stopping to build a mosque every Friday. These were almost certainly cheap little travel mosques, constructed for the procession as it journeyed towards Mecca. But they still represented a delay, and when your retinue consists of 60,000 people and who knows how many animals, any delay is an expensive delay. Still, Musa doesn't seem to have cared one bit. When he arrived in Cairo, Musa gave 20,000 gold pieces in alms to the poor. Imagine being the first beggar to have a stinking great bag of gold dropped in your lap. Surely you'd think it was a joke. Anyway, given the sheer size of his expedition, he must have been spending gold like a suspiciously well-off drunken sailor, just to house and feed his retinue, to say nothing of the spending of individuals within his entourage. This veritable river of gold was repeated, including the 20,000 gold pieces in alms, in Medina, and then again in the holy city of Mecca itself. Now, as for the pilgrimage, I won't pretend to know exactly what the business end of a Hajj actually entails, so suffice to say, Musa did what he came to do in the holy city, and then he departed for home. But when he was planning his grand pilgrimage, there was one thing that Musa had seemingly failed to properly account for: actually paying for the return journey. He had essentially exhausted his travelling treasury, and this was compounded by the very fact that he had exhausted his travelling treasury. You see, the economies of West Africa were used to having large amounts of gold in circulation. Indeed, as far as we can tell, gold dust was actually one of the main currencies in the Mali Empire, so gold was just part of their everyday reality. Not so for the economies of the Mediterranean. Cairo was actually the Mediterranean hub for gold trading, where European merchants would come to exchange for the precious metal that had been extracted somewhere in the east. So you can imagine that the gold traders of Cairo might have been more than a little annoyed when this African king appeared apparently from nowhere, with his admittedly impressive retinue, no doubt whispering amongst themselves that he must be compensating for something, and then dumped a whole lot of gold into the market. Now, if you recall, Musa had brought 8 tons of gold dust. He was also accompanied by 12,000 slaves carrying 1.8 kilogram gold bars. We don't know exactly how many bars, so for the sake of simplicity, let's just say that they had one each, which works out at 21.6 tons in gold bars. So, realistically, we're looking at about 30 tons of gold at a minimum. A minimum. It may come as no surprise to learn, then, that Musa had spent so much gold in his journey to Mecca that he had actually triggered a huge devaluation of the metal. His passage through the various cities of Egypt and Arabia caused prices to skyrocket. In effect, Musa was a travelling devaluation machine. But the gold traders and moneylenders were probably mollified when Musa proceeded to borrow back all the gold he could get his hands on to fund his journey back to Mali. Since the Mansa apparently didn't much care what the interest rates were, the gold traders pushed them as high as was acceptable, probably laughing all the while. Now, I'm about to make a comparison to the movie The Big Short, and the only reason I'm doing this is because I watched it recently, so it's on the brain, so to speak. So in this analogy, the gold traders are like the big Wall Street banks, laughing because they are absolutely certain that they have made a deal that will make them loads and loads of money. Anyway, now that Musa was sucking all the gold back up, it transitioned from saturation to scarcity. The value inevitably spiked once again, and prices also dropped accordingly. This was a situation that more or less continued until Musa crossed back into his own territory, whereupon he promptly cracked open the imperial treasury and paid back the colossal amount of gold he had been lent, plus interest, in a single payment. This second wave of gold was even larger than the first, and once again the value of gold fell off a cliff. And the moneylenders and gold traders? Well, just like those Wall Street bankers, they were ruined. They went from this to this. And I realize this is an imperfect comparison, but oh well. Anyway, this single repayment caused a gold recession in the Mediterranean that lasted for a decade. Many historians believe that this is the only time in recorded history that one man has directly controlled the price of gold in the Mediterranean. And this is an important point, because there is a school of thought, one that I find at least partially convincing, that Musa's great pilgrimage was less about fulfilling his religious duty and more about introducing the Mali Empire and Musa himself to the wider world. A debut on the world stage, as it were. According to these historians, Musa wanted to attract large numbers of Muslim proselytizers, scholars, and architects to the empire in an effort to promote Islam amongst a population that still largely clung to their native beliefs. The second part to this theory, and the part that I'm not really convinced about, is that Musa wanted to make the Mali cities of Goa and Timbuktu the premier gold markets in the world, something that he would not be able to do as long as the gold traders of Cairo controlled the flow of the precious metal into the Mediterranean. You can probably see where this is going. With this interpretation in mind, Musa's single-handed destruction of the largest and most important gold market in the Mediterranean was a deliberate ploy to get those traders to come to Mali instead. Like I said, I don't know about this part. Musa engaging in economic warfare without anyone realizing seems too clever by half. But then who knows? Maybe everyone else was playing checkers while Musa was playing chess. But in any case, if the goal of the pilgrimage was to put Mali on the map, so to speak, then Musa had indisputably achieved that, because not only did he instantly garner a reputation as one of the wealthiest men in the world, he actually appears on the medieval world map known as the Catalan Atlas, which was created in 1375. He is, quite literally, on the map. And when it comes to his estimated net worth, it is this reputation, more than anything else, that has put him at the top of many historical rich lists. I say this reputation because actual numbers certainly don't put him there. Fundamentally, we have absolutely no way of properly quantifying just how rich Musa was. There are many reasons why this is the case, but the first is because we have literally no idea how much gold Musa actually possessed. We have a rough idea how much he took on his pilgrimage, but that is almost certainly a fraction of the wealth that remained behind in the imperial treasury in Mali. A treasury, incidentally, about which we have zero information. Zilch. Nada. Now, I would like to make a broader point about historical rich lists in general. Accurately converting pre-modern historical currency into modern currency is almost impossible. For starters, you're probably comparing two inherently different types of currency. Generally speaking, pre-modern coins are intrinsic currency, in that their value is based on the metal actually in the coin. Our currencies, on the other hand, are representative currency, deriving their value from something much larger, such as the Federal Reserve of Gold, i.e. the gold standard, or even the economy as a whole. Additionally, we're essentially applying a modern capitalist conception of wealth to historical figures who lived in very different circumstances. I mean, sometimes it works, but mostly it doesn't. This is something that I could go on about for ages, but this video is already long enough and I don't want to bore you, so I'm going to leave it there. Actually, I have one more thing to say. The last point I want to make is that these historical rich lists are generally pretty Eurocentric. Very rarely do figures from Asia, for example, appear on such lists. Think of Hessian, a notoriously corrupt Qing dynasty official whose wealth, confiscated after his execution, was estimated by his contemporaries as equal to 15 years of the annual income of the entire Qing imperial government. Or maybe the 17th century Japanese daimyo Maeda Tohitsune, whose feudal domains were assessed at the time as having the theoretical agricultural output to feed 1.2 million people. I'm pretty confident that these two guys, and many, many others, were richer than, say, William de Warenne, 1st Earl of Surrey, or Richard FitzAlan, 10th Earl of Arundel. Just a hunch. Anyway, Mansa Musa, rich as sin? Absolutely. Worth $400 billion? Who knows? So perhaps, given all that we have just discussed, Musa's wealth should be described as immeasurable, which is apt in more ways than one. He may indeed have been the richest man in history, but he also may not have been. Maybe that Hessian bloke was. The point is, we will never know, and anyone who puts him at the top of any list with any certainty, or, God forbid, an actual figure for his wealth, is just pulling it out of their ass. Please excuse my French. And this, my friends, is why historical rich lists are a load of rubbish. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe. You can find more great history content on the Real History website via the link in the description, and you can also find Real History on various social media platforms, where I post lots of cool stuff that isn't posted anywhere else, so feel free to head over and take a look. Finally, as always, I would like to thank my patrons. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your support. If you are not a patron but are considering becoming one, you can head over to the Real History Patreon page to find out what kind of benefits you can get. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.